Hi, welcome again to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Greenawalt, and this is Public Administration, Government 241. Let's pick up on the theme of decision making. I'm not certain, maybe you guys could tell me, my memory's rather poor as to whether or not we started this or not. I don't believe that we did. But if we did, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of repetition. Let's look at the area of decision making. First of all, when we're studying decision making, we find that there's two widespread misconceptions about decision making. The first widespread misconception about decision making is we tend to view organizations as monolithic, with all the decision making power focused at the top of the pyramid. And the second widespread misconception about decision making is that the behavior of decision makers, wherever they are located in the organization, corresponds to the rational comprehensive model. And again, you should have your PowerPoints by your side for this presentation, whether it be on your electronic device or if you've run them off in a form of papers. Well, when we look at this, when we talk about the rational comprehensive model, we have to, excuse me a minute. We have to remember when we're talking about the rational comprehensive model that there are a number of steps in the rational comprehensive model of decision making. There's 9 different steps. Let's take a look at that so we're aware of that before we address these two widespread misconceptions. What is the rational comprehensive model of decision making? The first step of the 9 is simply a recognition of the problem. We recognize the problem. Number 2, we collect data on the problem, right? Third, we classify the data and we try to analyze the data. Fourth, we prepare an inventory of means, of ways that we can achieve our objectives. Once we have an inventory of all the ways we can achieve our objectives, then we can list possible solutions, possible alternative solutions. Then number 6, we evaluate all these alternative solutions through a process of through a process of evaluation. Number 7, we have to make the decision. Number 8, we implement the decision. And number 9, we obtain feedback on our results. Now, Grover Starling tells us that the rational decision maker consistently maximizes these values. We'll take a look at that throughout this presentation. Well, if we look at this first misconception of decision making, we find that organizational theorist James Thompson, he points out that control by one single all-powerful individual, and he puts, actually that's a quote from his writing, control by a single all-powerful individual is possible only when that person isn't dependent on any other people for information or expertise in making decisions. That would make this first misconception indeed very unlikely, indeed, that we would ever have a organization that was controlled at the top by one individual. That one individual would have to have a law degree in order that they wouldn't need any advice from counsel. They would have to be very skilled in accounting and administrative management so that they wouldn't need any the team of MBAs around them. Very, very difficult to find all these characteristics and all this background in one person. In an organization of even modest complexity, it's possible that this could exist, but it certainly doesn't exist in our highly sophisticated and complex organizations, which we find in modern society. The second misconception, in 1960, the team of Fifner and Nicolaides, we've talked about Fifner and Nicolaides before. Fifner and Nicolaides, and they're still alive today and still writing, but in 1960, they concluded that administrators do not follow a logical progression of steps in making decisions. Find that they do not follow a logical progression of steps in making decisions. They don't follow the rational comprehensive model, in other words. In all the cases that they discovered, in all the cases that they studied, the decision-making process begins with step 6, the evaluation of alternatives. We find that many administrators take what we consider to be common sense shortcuts. They have gone through many of these problems for years. They've been looking at many of the same problems. And so they don't want to cover the ground that they've already trod on many, many times by going through the first 5 steps. So many of them are willing to jump in on step 6. And when they don't jump in on step 6, this is called administrative rationality instead of the rational comprehensive model. But administrative rationality. You find that when these administrators do that, you find that they also take into account other factors that organizational theorists have overlooked in many instances. In helping to explain why certain decisions are made and others are not, we find that frequently decision makers will take into account factors such as emotions, politics, personality, and mental health. Let's look at emotions, for example. When the Congressional Budget Office was first formed in the 1970s, during that decade of reform in the Congress, we find that the Democrats were largely in control of the Congress throughout this decade, and we find that the Republicans and the Democrats reached an agreement that Alice Rivlin would be the first director of the CBO. Now, Alice Rivlin was probably one of the most knowledgeable people in Washington, D.C. on the federal budget. She worked for the Brookings Institution. And so everyone agreed that she would come in and serve her term, and then she would step down, and then the Republicans would choose a director, and the Democrats and Republicans would alternate choosing directors. Well, Alice Rivlin came in, and she served her term, did so well, got the CBO off the ground, but lo and behold, as the end of her first term approached, her husband apparently had an affair and ran away with another lady. And we find that Alice was so distraught that the legislative leaders in the Congress decided to go ahead and give her another term. And this was not what was going to be originally. That was not what was supposed to happen. But here emotions intervened. They cared about Alice Rivlin. They felt she did a good job, and they didn't want to see her leaving under those circumstances. So they gave her another term. Politics comes into decision making, whether or not a person is a member of one party or the other. Does matter on Capitol Hill in Harrisburg, and it does matter on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Personality, oh, what better example than Richard Nixon. Once Senator Kennedy, Senator John Kennedy's father, Joseph, hired Dick Tuck to be the first political prankster in the modern era, and he dogged Richard Nixon's campaign all through the 1960 presidential election season. You find that, yes, Nixon felt persecuted, beleaguered, and felt like a single warrior against overwhelming odds all the time. And this certainly became part of his personality. Always felt that he was the single warrior trying to achieve his lofty ambitions, the right causes. And you find this leads to the atmosphere in the White House during the Watergate crisis. Once President Nixon's lieutenants decide to execute, they plan and execute the Watergate situation, the Watergate incident, you find that President Nixon's natural reaction was to not to turn them over to law enforcement, but let's take a look at this. Let's hear and consider what actually happened and what our alternatives were. And as soon as he hesitated for a moment and didn't turn these associates of his over to law enforcement, he was responsible for a cover-up. And so that is why, in fact, he had to resign. But the personality, certainly all the political tricks, political mischief that was used against him in the early 1960s certainly changed his personality, and it led ultimately to this sequence of events. And fourth and finally would be mental health. And that you could find, oh my goodness, when we had, after the Second World War, we appointed James Forrestal to be the first secretary of, we didn't call it the Defense Department initially. After the Second World War, we took the Department of War, which was the Army, the Department of the Navy, the Army Air Force, and we combined them into what we now know as the Department of Defense. First it was called the Department of the Military Establishments, some unwieldy, awkward name like that. And James Forrestal, who was a brilliant administrator, and of course we know the Forrestal line of ships in the Navy that are named for him, we find that he was appointed as the first and confirmed as the first Secretary of Defense, if you will. But he ended up just a little bit after the Second World War's conclusion, he ended up committing suicide. He was in Bethesda Naval Hospital and supposedly threw himself out of a window and committed suicide. There is some controversy about this, and we'll never know whether or not it was suicide or whether it was something else. But he had serious bipolar issues, and I guess that he was not taking his medicine at that time, or the medicine had ceased to be effective for him. So this method of decision making, by jumping in at step 6, is referred to as administrative rationality rather than orthodox rationality. Orthodox rationality is the term we use to refer to following all the steps in the rational comprehensive model. Well, these findings of Fifner and Nicolaides are absolutely consistent with the work of Charles Lindblom. In the 1970s and 1980s, Charles Lindblom was all the rage. You find that his books were bestsellers, and you couldn't keep them on the bookstore shelf. They were really very much in demand at the time. But Charles Lindblom came up with a theory of satisficing. He said that decision makers satisfice. S-A-T-I-S-F-I-C-E. They satisfice. What he's talking about there is incrementalism. He was saying that administrators, particularly in the public sector, will tweak an existing policy just a little bit one way or the other to try to solve an existing problem, rather than coming up with a radically new solution. They'll simply change existing policy just a bit and hope that that will solve the problem. This is called, of course, incrementalism. He called it satisficing. Well, as we look at decision making, we have to look at how the best decisions are made. And we tend to see that better decisions are made not by individuals, but by small groups. And you find that group dynamics become a very powerful force in shaping many, many government decisions. You find that small policy groups will make better decisions if they're very cohesive. But we have to remember that small groups can fall victim to what we call groupthink. Groupthink, what is it? Groupthink is a mode of thinking that people engage in when all the members are striving, are yearning, are working for unanimity. And those yearnings for unanimity override all of the motivation that they have to realistically appraise all the alternative courses of action. This is the resistance of a group to information that may run counter to what has always been the group consensus. But what are the symptoms of groupthink? And I'd like, and of course, these are on your PowerPoint, and I'd like you to remember these symptoms of groupthink, in addition to the stages of the rational comprehensive model. But the symptoms of groupthink are, number one, a feeling of invulnerability. The group is right, and it will triumph. You are the good guys, you wear the white hats. Secondly, there's collective efforts to rationalize, that try to discount, they try to ignore warnings that might lead members to reconsider their assumptions. So collective efforts to rationalize warnings, to discard them, to discount them, that might lead individuals in the group to reconsider their assumptions. Number three, there's a complete faith in the group's inherent morality. Number four, you have a stereotype view of your adversary's leaders. You think your adversary's leaders are weak, you think they're evil, you think they're stupid, and therefore they're easily outwitted. Number five, you find if there are any dissenters that emerge within your group, you find that generally there is direct pressure placed on them to show the proper loyalty to the group. Number six, you have self-censorship of deviation from the apparent group consensus. In other words, if a member comes upon some information that's not in accordance with the group's consensus, and they develop serious reservations, serious doubts about whether or not the group is doing the right thing, they will swallow their doubts. They'll just put it aside, they'll suppress it, and they'll ignore it and say, I don't know what I was thinking, I have to continue to go along with the group consensus. We've been right so far, I'm sure we'll be right in the future. Number seven, there's a shared illusion of unanimity. Everyone thinks that everyone else in the group is in agreement. There's a shared illusion of unanimity, and everyone is presumed to be in agreement all the time. Number eight, you find the emergence of self-appointed mind guards. Self-appointed mind guards, these are individuals who will try to maintain the group consensus and to whip members into line if they ever consider viewpoints that are not in accordance with the group consensus. But where do we see groupthink? I know that groupthink developed in my small group that was successful in obtaining the majority and actually then all the seats on the school board, which I served on many years ago. We had a majority, and then as I said, we captured all the seats. And I think we were doing a very good job. We did many things that were long delayed. whether it was, oh my, whether it was advanced placement classes, whether it was a homework hotline, whether it was a girls' soccer team, whether it was taking foreign language instruction and moving it, making it available a grade sooner. These were just some of the things that the establishment of an education foundation to provide private funds to supplement the school's budget for things that the school couldn't ordinarily afford, such as field trips. I like to think we were doing a great job, and we had to, however, tell the public what we were doing or they wouldn't know. So we put out a newsletter. Sometime after I had to move away from the district, and several other board members had stepped down as well, and there were some new members. The membership decided, the school board decided to discontinue the newsletter, at least for a while, and therefore the public didn't know all the things, all the work that they were doing and all the things they were accomplishing. And in the next election, they lost their majority. This would be certainly an example of groupthink. We don't need this newsletter anymore. Well, you find that on the national level, let's go to the Kennedy administration and let's look at the Bay of Pigs example. You find that the Bay of Pigs was a project which the Eisenhower administration initially put together. You find there were lots of Cubans that fled Cuba after Castro assumed power, and he started to nationalize everything. He seized everyone's property. You would own nothing any longer. The state owned everything. For example, Hemingway had lived in Cuba. His boat Pilar and all of his writings, his archives were seized by the Castro regime. He fled Cuba as well, and some people believe that this was one of the main reasons why he committed suicide the next year in Idaho. I don't know if the truth of that or not, but just one can't help but think it contributed. At any rate, you find that the Cubans who had fled Cuba, and most of them had gone to Florida, they approached the Eisenhower administration and said, we would like to be trained. We would like the opportunity to do what Castro did. We'd like to start a uprising in the mountains of eastern Cuba. We can hide out there, and we will slowly expand. And once the people know we are there now, they're ready to rise up against Castro and throw off his regime. So the Eisenhower administration worked with two Central American governments and trained the refugees. When the Kennedy administration came into office, President Kennedy kept Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA. Allen Dulles, of course, was the brother of John Foster Dulles, who had been one of our most brilliant and effective Secretary of States, who had worked under President Eisenhower until his death, and then was replaced by Christian Herter. But you find that the Kennedy administration asked the Eisenhower administration if this was a viable project. They said yes. President Kennedy didn't look very much at this project. He didn't dig into it and really do a serious investigation. There was a bit of groupthink involved here. The project, I should say, moved on. And eventually Kennedy lets it occur. It occurs on the wrong place. It shouldn't occur in the southwest portion of the island in the Bay of Pigs. It should have occurred on the southeastern shoreline. They were far, far away from the mountains that they hoped to melt into. In fact, they landed and the Cuban National Guard was 1/4 mile away conducting regular exercises. When the Cuban National Guard heard that there was a landing, they simply moved their machine guns to the beach, and as the Cubans walked ashore. With their weapons, they were mowed down by machine gun fire. Now, we had promised that we would provide air cover, and we had airplanes in the air right above this. And the pilots were waiting for the order from the White House to pull the trigger. And they said they could have wiped out the Cuban National Guard in a matter of minutes. And for whatever reason, President Kennedy hesitated and he didn't give the order. And all those Cubans were destroyed. We find that this would later lead the president to have nightmares for the rest of his life. He would wake up in the middle of the night asking Jackie, or lamenting to Jackie, that all these men were dying. So this was President Kennedy's experience with groupthink in regard to the Bay of Pigs. So therefore, when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs, a year later, we find that the Kennedy administration goes about their decision making in a much different way because of what happened in the Bay of Pigs. How did they ensure that there wouldn't be groupthink here? Well, number one, we find, of course, what had happened. President Kennedy had gone to Vienna to an international meeting. He met the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev took his measure of Kennedy, thought he was young, he was callow, he was weak, and he couldn't stand up to the pressure that Khrushchev could place on him. So Khrushchev went ahead and he sent intermediate range nuclear missiles to be based in Cuba. Our U-2 reconnaissance flights detected the presence of these missiles and these Russian construction crews, and we immediately went into a deliberative phase as to how we were going to respond. Well, in order that we didn't have groupthink develop again, you had that President Kennedy appointed a task force to deal with this issue. He put in charge of the task force his major political advisor. We've talked about this before. Who was President Kennedy's major political advisor? It was his brother, Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General. And we find that Bobby Kennedy assembled all the people within the cabinet and within the government, within the administration, who would be responsible for dealing with this. The Secretaries of Defense, the Secretary of State, head of the National Security Council, and so forth. But you find that they brought in a few new people, a few people from the Truman administration, a few people from the Eisenhower administration, right away to supplement their expertise. You find that the president didn't attend all the meetings, because what happens when the president is in attendance at a meeting? What happens when any head of an agency is at a meeting? Find that the participants in a meeting tend to be more reserved. They don't tend to share all their thoughts. President Kennedy knew this, and he wanted to be sure that all the participants at the table said everything on their minds, shared everything. So the president consciously absented himself from meetings early or didn't attend a few, so that everyone would feel comfortable saying whatever or sharing whatever was on their mind. In the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you find that new people are brought in. Not only did we have new people outside the administration being brought in at the beginning of the process, but halfway through the process, we bring in another group of new people that had been from prior administrations to see if they were missing anything. And finally, Bobby Kennedy, the chair of this particular committee, consistently and consciously probed all the members to make sure that they did not overlook anything, and they considered every possible alternative. We find that at the beginning there was a consensus that Cuba was going to have to be invaded. We were going to have to send a task force and simply sweep Castro from power. Then we're thinking of airstrikes. But with airstrikes, we're going to kill all those Russians and construction crews. And what problems would that cause with the Soviet Union? We want to make sure if we have airstrikes that we take out the whole, all the missile sites and all the missiles. So finally, the Kennedy administration ends up opting for what? We end up opting for a naval blockade. We surround Cuba and we stop every boat going in and coming out. And of course, our naval superiority is very useful, particularly so close, I should say, close to the United States and so far away from the Soviet Union. We could marshal an enormous naval superiority, and we did. Well, what are the factors that influence decisions? And of course, what we find is that groupthink did not develop in the Bay of Pigs. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it did in the Bay of Pigs situation. So those precautions that the Kennedy administration took in regard to the missile crisis paid off, because this was handled quite well. The blockade forced the Cubans and the Soviets to rethink, and the Soviets dismantled their intermediate missiles and shipped them back to the Soviet Union. And we allowed them to save face in two ways. By the way, we allowed them to save face by doing what? Well, one, we were scheduled to dismantle old intermediate ranged missiles that we had in Turkey. So we did that, and Khrushchev could say, aha, we're bringing our missiles back from Cuba, but the Americans are taking their missiles out of Turkey. That was scheduled before the Bay of Pigs, before the Cuban Missile Crisis had even begun. The other thing is that the Kennedy administration gave Fidel Castro and gave Khrushchev our assurance that we would not invade and supplant, we would not displace Castro while he was there. And that was enough. And they withdrew their missiles, and we resolved that peacefully. The world was very, very close at that point to a nuclear exchange. I remember President Kennedy addressing the nation on our little black and white TV in the living room, and it was a very tense time internationally. We came as close as we ever have in my lifetime to nuclear disaster. Well, what are the factors that influence decisions? Let's go ahead and take a look at these. The factors that influence decisions are, number one, an organization member's view of their role. What is their role supposed to be? And that will guide their decisions, to be sure. You find that we are influenced by the expectations of others on how we should behave. We find that a good example of this would have been in the Nixon administration. We were going to be spending more money for the first time in the federal budget on domestic affairs than on military and foreign affairs for the very first time outside of war. So we find that President Nixon was assembling, trying to streamline and trying to consolidate some of the programs of the Great Society in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And HEW was so large and so unwieldy, he looked for one of the best budgeteers he could possibly find, and that person was Caspar Weinberger, who was a private businessman with Bechtel Corporation, an international company out of California. Well, he brings Caspar Weinberger to Washington, D.C., and Weinberger is supposed to look at every penny that HEW spends and make sure that each penny is usefully used and no money is wasted. So he slashes and cuts budgets, and we find that Caspar Weinberger, from his cutting of budgets, becomes known as Mac the Knife. Mac the Knife. Then that is the expectation that others had of him, that he was supposed to cut budgets. Well, that was his role in the Nixon administration, It's as the Nixon administration leaves office, Caspar Weinberger goes back to California, rejoins the Bechtel Corporation until Ronald Reagan becomes president. Ronald Reagan is casting about for a new Secretary of Defense. He believes that the defenses of the country have been left to diminish, and they're flabby, and they need to be strengthened and expanded. And so, who would be the best person to oversee such a strengthening of the U.S. Armed Forces? He eventually decides that it would be Caspar Weinberger, and asks Caspar Weinberger to return to Washington, D.C. As the Secretary of Defense. And Caspar accepts. And now he comes to Washington, D.C., and instead of looking at every penny and slashing budgets, Caspar Weinberger is looked upon by all as one who needs to find resources, muster resources, and muster support for the Defense Department as the U.S. Navy, U.S. Air Force, and the Army in particular, and Marines are rebuilt and strengthened. So all of a sudden, instead of looking at every penny and cutting the budget, now Caspar Weinberger is given a shovel and saying you should shovel money and shovel funds into the Defense Department. So Mac the Knife is transformed into Mac the Shovel. It's interesting how we behave quite differently when we change positions and others' expectations of us change. Well, another factor that influences decisions would be outside pressures, pressures from interest groups, pressures from the press, pressures from the general public. And those pressures can come from anywhere in a public administrator's environment. The third factor that will influence decisions are sunk costs. Sunk costs, of course, are previous investments of time, energy, and resources. And we find that even when policies fail, administrators are frequently trying frantically to search for evidence that would confirm that their original actions were correct. That's all, they're acting that way because of sunk costs. A great example of this could be found at Union Station in Washington, D.C. By the time of the Carter administration, even though I hope all of you have been to seen Union Station, it's right across from the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. You can easily walk between the two buildings, and we find that it's one of the most impressive buildings in the United States, the large, beautiful arches. When my family went to Washington, D.C. for the first time, my father had been a surveyor before he became a biologist, and he took us to see Union Station before the White House and before the Capitol. He was always so impressed with the building and the architectural style. That was the first thing I saw. Well, at any rate, we find that during the Carter administration, train traffic passenger traffic had diminished by a large margin. And we find that since passenger train traffic had fallen off, there was hardly any traffic in Union Station. Well, we're coming up on 1976, and 1976 is going to be the bicentennial. We are celebrating 200 years of independence. Now, President Ford is in office through 76, but of course the presidential election in 76 is won by Jimmy Carter. So this actually begins under the Ford administration, but really most of this then takes place under the Carter administration. We find that passenger train traffic falls off. We were looking for a spot to have a bicentennial visitor center in Washington, D.C. Particularly, congressmen felt that when their constituents came to town, they needed a focal point, a place where they could base their explorations of D.C. from. So they chose Union Station, and they decided to turn it into a visitor center. They put two double wide trailers in back of Union Station, and that was the new train station. Well, you find that they put in very deep carpet. The carpet was about that deep. It was plush, you would sink way into it. And they filled the buildings with little tiny dinoramas showing different parts of Washington, D.C. Well, they didn't fix the roof, and the roof leaked. Now, you can just imagine what happens to a carpet when water infiltrates it and is not dried out or not cleaned. You find that the carpet began to rot, it smelled bad, and moreover, the whole conception, the whole idea was perhaps flawed from the inception, because lo and behold, if I'm in Washington, D.C. and I'm there to visit the Capitol, do I want to go into Union Station and look at a little model of the Capitol building? Or do I want to walk 100 yards and see the Capitol building, see the Library of Congress, see the Supreme Court? Of course I want to just walk across the hill and see it. I don't want to stare at a little toy model, but for some reason the planners of this didn't understand. When visitorship was not nearly what everyone expected it to be, you find that they said, well, the visitors just don't have a place to park. We're going to build a parking garage, this big, beautiful, massive new parking garage right behind Union Station. And then visitorship will pick up to the visitor center. And they did, and that wonderful parking lot that you've probably used if you've been to Union Station was a result of this justification to try to correct the situation at Union Station. Well, the parking garage didn't increase the traffic through Union Station, and we find that eventually, as train traffic then begins to really pick up through the gas problems and gas rationing of the Carter years, we find that Union Station is essentially, the roof is fixed, that terrible rug is taken out, and it is restored to its former position as a train station, which continues to this day, and it's one of the nicest train stations, I think, in America. But at any rate, why did Congress flail about and not change it back much more quickly? Well, it was because of sunk costs. They had spent time, money, and effort, and they wanted to see that the visitor center would succeed. It never did. The fourth factor in influencing decisions are personality characteristics, kinds of decisions that officials make are determined by their own personalities in many instances. The recruitment process of any agency, therefore, tries to bring in individuals with the right attitudes, with the right personality. We find that frequently your different organizations around the country, both public and private, when they're trying to fill a position, they'll bring job applicants in. And sometimes we may find a job applicant who may be just outstanding in every way, but they are very awkward with their social skills, and they may clash with others' personalities. So it's probably not the best idea to bring them in, and you bring in someone who's a better fit with the other individuals and with the culture of the organization, even if they may not quite be as good as the other applicant. Well, Anthony Downs has ruminated about this topic as well. He believes in government, that most officials in government bureaucracies, for example, most government officials are not risk takers, they're risk conservers. They're risk conservers. What is a risk conserver? A risk conserver is someone who wishes to maintain the status quo. A risk conserver is someone who wants to reduce their efforts. A risk conserver is someone who wants to avoid blame. And a risk conserver is someone who wants to avoid blame by avoiding responsibility. Well, the fifth factor that we see influencing decisions is the influence of outside reference groups. An outside reference group are the circle of individuals who a decision maker cares about. They care about their opinions, about their feelings. It's the kinds of people in society with whom the decision maker identifies. And you find this is certainly true when we're using in and outers in the government. In and outers are people that will serve in government for a while and return to the private sector, return to government, return to the private sector. These people wish to maintain the respect and the confidence of people on the outside, their outside peer groups. Best example of this could be Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, of course, was the National Security Affairs Advisor for President Nixon at the beginning of his term, as well, his first term and into his second term, till he's finally nominated and confirmed as the Secretary of State for President Nixon at the end of his time in office, and then carried over into the Ford administration. But we find that President Nixon ends the war in Vietnam for a bit until Watergate comes up, and you find that in order to end the war in Vietnam, we find that the North Vietnamese were aware that Nixon might win the election of 1972, and they were aware that if he won the election of 1972, they were going to be dealing with someone who was in a much stronger position and had 4 more years to double down on the forces that were working against them in Southeast Asia. So you find that America and North Vietnam were negotiating in Paris, the Paris Peace Accords, Paris Peace negotiations, I should say. And you find that we, in order to try to bring the North Vietnamese to the table to sign an end to the war, that we begin to intensify our bombing efforts. After President Nixon wins the election of 1972 in a landslide, he wins every state except Massachusetts and except the District of Columbia. What does he do? You find that he decides to use the Air Force to cut all the rail lines between North Vietnam and China so that they can't be refortified, rearmed, given reinforcements. And then he uses the Air Force and the Navy to place mines in Haiphong Harbor, the main port for North Vietnam, to stop Soviet ships primarily from sailing in the harbor and bringing in new materials and new guns and ammunition and so forth for the North Vietnamese. So we send a huge swarm of helicopters over Haiphong Harbor, drop the mines in place, and you find that President Nixon, after winning, goes to Camp David. Now, Henry Kissinger is at Paris with the North Vietnamese negotiator Lee Duc Tho, and every day America starts to bomb North Vietnam in a more intense fashion, and there is increasing and increasing and increasing. And Henry Kissinger is telling Lee Duc Tho is that he hasn't been in contact with Nixon. He doesn't know what Nixon is thinking, and he doesn't know what Nixon's going to do. And every day the pressure got more and more. And finally the pressure got so great on the North Vietnamese that they said, okay, we'll sign. Nixon came off the mountain, came down from Camp David, returned to the White House. Henry Kissinger signed the peace accord with Lee Duc Tho with a smile, and left Paris to return to the United States. We find that America's bombing during this period of time drew criticism, particularly from liberal groups and from academia. And so Kissinger, of course, what did Kissinger do before the Nixon administration? He was a lifelong college professor at Harvard. So what he did in March of 1973, he reserved um, the house right across the street from the White House, where all visiting dignitaries stay normally when they visit Washington, D.C. He reserved that house for a weekend in March, and he invited all of Harvard's faculty to Washington, D.C. And he invited the faculty so that he could explain to them why the Nixon administration took the course of action it did, and to show them that it ended up paying off at that point in time. And why did he do that? He didn't have to do that. He did that because of the influence of outside reference groups. Henry Kissinger thought that when he was done serving as National Security Affairs Advisor, maybe Secretary of State, which eventually he was, he wanted to go back to teaching. And so he wanted to maintain the respect and the confidence of those individuals that he taught with. Well, number six, a sixth factor that influences decision would be other past conditioning. Previous training that you've had is going to influence the way in which you make decisions. You find that this is particularly true when you compare field office representatives with headquarter representatives. People that work in headquarters all their life may desire policies which people in the field know are infeasible. And field representatives in an agency find may become socialized by the group that they are assigned to. This is always a problem in diplomacy. When we have ambassadors sent abroad, we have to be very careful that the ambassadors stay as representatives or voices of the United States, and they do not become voices of the country that they're serving in to America. So when we send a ambassador to, for example, Bolivia, we want to make sure that the ambassador maintains his or her position as the American voice to and in Bolivia, as opposed to Bolivia's voice to the United States. That's one of the reasons why in the United States we have a different posting policy for foreign service staff than does the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom generally will send their foreign service personnel to one country for a career. So they will know the language well, they'll know the customs and traditions well. Now that's great, but if they've been in that country for 12, 14, 20 years, fairly soon they become socialized, and you find that they become more concerned about that country's viewpoint or welfare as opposed to the United Kingdom's. Here in the United States, we will send someone off to an embassy and a foreign posting, and you'll find that they'll only be there for 2 years, 4 years, and then they'll be brought back to the United States. They'll be brought back to the United States for 2 years or so. They will be trained to speak another language, and they'll be given a different posting. The nice thing about that is that American foreign service staff do not become socialized. The bad thing about that is you don't find the same levels sometimes of expertise and knowledge of a country as you might find in the Foreign Service of the United Kingdom. Well, you find that good organizations, for example, in the case of the situation with field office representatives and headquarter representatives, good organizations try to shuffle their people, their personnel between these two positions so that everyone gets an overview and a good understanding of the complete operations of the organization. Now, what are some common errors in decision making? Some common errors in decision making are number one, cognitive nearsightedness. We can't see the forest for the trees. We are looking at one part of a problem and not at the whole problem. Cognitive nearsightedness. Secondly, sometimes we assume that the future will repeat the past. Not always true. Thirdly, we tend to oversimplify situations. Fourthly, sometimes we have an over-reliance on our own experiences. Number five, we can suffer from preconceived notions. I know many times I've made perhaps a poor judgment based on the fact I was relying on a preconceived notion. Number six, an unwillingness to experiment. And number seven, a reluctance to decide. All of these errors can result in treating the symptom rather than the cause of a problem. Treating the symptom rather than the cause of a problem. A reluctance to decide, what would be a good example of that? A reluctance to decide, as we approach the end of the Carter administration, we find that there's a belief that, we approach the end of the Ford administration. We can go back to that time. At the end of the Ford administration and through the Carter administration, there's a belief that America's not keeping up with the Soviet Union in terms of strategic armaments. We still believe that our armaments are more accurate, but they're older and they're smaller. The Soviet armaments are larger, they're less accurate, but they are far more powerful and they're newer. So we're wondering how to respond to that. Of course, in America, we've always had a nuclear deterrent that's been based on the triad. There are three pillars to our nuclear strategy. We have B-52 bombers in the air 24/7, or we did from the end of the Second World War until the Berlin Wall came down. And then we took the bombers out of the air 24/7. As far as I know, they're back up again. But we have B-52s and B-1s in the air all the time with nuclear armaments that are ready to go to Moscow or Beijing on a moment's notice. So we have planes in the sky, we have submarines beneath the sea, we have nuclear submarines that are heavily armed with nuclear armaments that can reach any point in the world. You find that those submarines are hard to detect. They move about, and the Soviets have never had a good record of being able to trace or track our submarines until recently. I don't know if it's changed in the last several years, but the submarines of the American fleet were undetectable. The Soviets never knew where we were, and we always knew where they were. You find that the third point on the triad would be the land-based nuclear missiles that are put in silos scattered throughout the United States. You find primarily they're scattered through the West and the Midwest. You find that if a country is to make a successful first strike against us, in other words, a nuclear strike, so that we will not be able to strike back at them with levels of damage that are unacceptable to them, you find that they'd have to take out all of our bombers, all of our submarines, and the land-based sites. Well, we were wondering how we could strengthen our triad. That is when, indeed, we entered a period of time where we decided to build the B-1 bomber and future generations of bombers. The B-52 is one of the best built bombers ever. You can just imagine that these bombers built just after Second World War are still flying today. Remarkable planes and exceptionally maintained. But we find that we, of course, then adopted new generations of submarines as well. But our land-based forces were what we were looking at. We had old silos and we had old missiles, Minuteman missiles in them. What we decided was we were going to use a new missile called the MX. It was bigger and even more accurate than what we had used in the past. So we are talking about all the ways that we might base this missile. Under the Carter administration, we're talking about an underground series of silos and tunnels that we would have, for example, 10 silos, and we might have 5 missiles, and all the missiles would be changed from silo to silo from time to time, and they would be moved by railroads underground. This is very, very expensive, and so we wanted to look at some other options. We decided then to look at the idea of putting our nuclear missiles on trains that would be running around the country all the time. So the Soviets would never know where the trains might be at any point in time. But the point there is, what would happen if a train derails in the middle of Lancaster? All of a sudden there's a nuclear missile sitting in the middle of Lancaster. So we discarded that idea. Then we thought, oh, we can put these missiles on special ships that would be moving about our coastline. And then we began to think, well, what happens if one of the ships sinks? Then we have a nuclear missile in the water, a possibility of radiation affecting the ecosystem, and we have to retrieve that. Finally, with the Reagan administration, we were opting towards something called DensePack. DensePack was that we were going to build new silos exceptionally close to one another. They would be super reinforced with many, many, many layers of concrete and steel. And the whole idea was to put them so close together so that the Soviets knew they'd have to knock all those missiles out at the same time. And in order to do that, they'd have to have several nuclear missiles coming in at the same site. And actually, they would run into one another before they hit the site and they detonate each other. That is the theory behind DensePack. Well, finally, under the Reagan administration, the reluctance to decide caught up with us. Finally, the Reagan administration decided what we're going to do is we're simply going to modernize the silos we have and put the new MX missile in them. But this is an example of a reluctance to decide and the errors it might solve and cause in decision making. Well, we're going to take a brief break right here, and we're going to come back in a minute, and we're going to complete the rest of decision making. We're going to come in with a discussion on the models of decision making. Just take a small break right now.